Well, when I was asked to speak about racism for today's meeting, I was a little daunted because it personally took me quite a long time to recognize my own racism, and I think of myself as an introspective person. My attempts to convince other white South Africans that we may have a racism problem haven't gone too well either. We don't see it. We do our best to avoid seeing it. It's almost as if we have amnesia about apartheid. None of us approved of it. None of us really were influenced by it. It was more than 20 years ago. Why are we even still worried about it? So I didn't really know how I was going to persuade all of you in about 10 minutes or less that racism is something that we need to take seriously. But then, fortunately, there was Matthew Tiernison. Now, Matthew Tiernison is practically a born free. He was born in the early 90s, I think. He went to a small multiracial private school. He is privileged enough to have achieved 2 master's degrees, and even though he is currently unemployed, he's still able to live in Noordhoek. So he's got no real reason to be racist or angry. Now, Matthew, as you probably know, made my job here much easier by going on Facebook to let the world know in the most vulgar and racist terms possible what he thinks of the present government. There is nothing he could have said of a racial nature to be more hurtful than black South Africans. And why? Well, because the minister dared to touch his love for sport. But then he did a beautiful thing. Seeing his racism blow up in the media to monstrous proportions, he went on a radio show to apologize. Now, he heartily agreed with the interviewer that people who are not racists don't say such words. It doesn't even occur to a non-racist to say the sorts of things that he said. And then with almost his next breath, he proceeded to insist that he's not actually a racist. Why is that? Even when there's indisputable evidence of it, almost no one can admit to being a racist. Why could not even Matthew Tiernison bring himself to say, I am racist? It's as if he has this image of himself as a good person, and so doing something deliberately awful, as he did, must have been accidental. It must have been sort of some strange intrusion into his character, but not who he really is. Even when his racism is plain to see, he wasn't able to own it. So perhaps the first reason why people don't recognize their own racism is that we know that racism is bad, and being labeled a racist, well, that's a disaster, and we think better of ourselves. We're not bad people. So when we think or say racist things, it's out of character for us. It's not really who we are. The second reason why I think we can't own up to racism is that we think that racism must be accompanied by hatred. It must be hostility towards people of another race. It's something that you have to do. So if I were to ask you, are you racist? Many of you would answer no, on the grounds that you haven't used the K word or assaulted a domestic worker or shambocked a Malawian recently. Use whatever example from the media you prefer. The problem is that racism is not behavior. It's much more than that. On a social level, as was nicely demonstrated in that video, racism has much more to do with how society is structured, the place that various race groups occupy in society. On a personal level, racism has much more to do with our attitudes towards others, the place that members of various race groups occupy in our thoughts and feelings. Racism is not active hostility. It's the passive assumption that whiteness is better and that blackness implies some sort of moral or intellectual or social inferiority. Racism is not a matter of hate. It's a matter of prejudice. Now, I want to think about that word prejudice for a second. It comes from 2 Latin roots. Of course, the pre meaning before or in advance of, and the judice is the same as all of our judicial words. It's got something to do with judgment. So prejudice is not originally a word that referred to hatred or to unfair treatment. It's merely to a prejudgment, an opinion about someone that is formed on the basis of some superficial quality, and without reference to who they actually are and what they're actually like. Now, perhaps the key moment for me in which I realized that I was this kind of racist happened about 10 years ago. I was driving through Constantia heading to work, and I just noticed a team of laborers working on the road, as often happens. And it might have been that one of the laborers was white. I'm not too sure. One way or another, it occurred to me that I would have seen it as unusual to see a white laborer, and I would have thought of him as working in some way below his station, whereas black laborers would be normal. For the first time, I understood how deeply that apartheid way of seeing the world was ingrained in me. I didn't act racist. I just realized that there was, for me anyway, a sort of rightness about black people occupying a lower station. I wasn't violent, I wasn't angry, I had no ill feeling whatsoever towards those workers, but I did something that was at the heart of all evil behavior. I put a different value on one person over another for completely arbitrary reasons. Now that makes me a racist at heart, or the label that I prefer to now use sounds much better: I'm a recovering racist. Racism is not only a matter of what we do or say, it's an internal issue that has to do with how we see the order of society. It is a prejudgment of someone's worth or intelligence. It affects who we trust, who we employ to do jobs that require a certain level of responsibility or expertise, who we look to for advice or guidance. So a racist is that lovely, friendly mum at school who still thinks nothing of referring to an adult worker as the girl or the garden boy. Racism is what made the white American cashier in a story I heard recently refuse to take payment from a black woman by check right after accepting payment from this woman's sister-in-law by check because she looks white. She's multiracial and looks white. Or if we use a sporting example to make Matthew Turnison happy, racism is why white cricket supporters grumbled about Alvaro Peterson as a quota player when he was selected in 2006, even though he had broken several domestic batting records the year before. Racism is why every underperforming black sportsman will be dismissed as a quota selection, and why underperforming white players should be given time to show their worth. Racism is why the murder of a white girl usually makes the headlines, and why the murder of a black girl almost never does. Racism is not about hostility. It's a prejudice that affects the trust that we put in people, the value that we place on their work or on their lives. Now, the Bible doesn't use the concept of race very often, but it certainly is aware of the damage that prejudice does. Listen to what James chapter 2 says about favoritism. It says, "Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, 'Here is a good seat for you,' but you say to the poor man, 'You stand there,' or 'Sit on the floor by my feet,' have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts?" He continues, "If you really kept the royal law found in Scripture, 'Love your neighbor as yourself,' you are doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers." By prejudging the worth of people on the basis of superficial things, such as their skin or their wealth, James says that we have become judges with evil thoughts. We have failed in our duty to love others. So to get back to Matthew Turnison, he had no good reason to be angry. He isn't some grizzled member of the Broederbond who bought into decades of apartheid propaganda. He's a normal white South African. He's also clearly racist, and yet he's the only one who can't see it. So what about you? Why do I want you to identify with Matthew Turnison? Well, firstly, because racism is clearly harmful to our country. If we fail to even recognize that we have a problem, well, then we're going to unconsciously blunder our way into causing more hurt and more division, just as Matthew did. But even more importantly than that, racism is also a barometer of a deeper problem. It's a clear fact of our national past and our national present that racism is a plague. But in spite of it being a fact, it's a problem that we almost universally are unable to acknowledge. So if we can fail to judge ourselves correctly, even on the matter of racism, which is easy, what other prejudices and corruption lives within us undetected? If you're not a Christian, one of the main reasons why you should look into Christianity more seriously, I think, is that racism is not the only hidden corruption that we fail to acknowledge about ourselves. The more accurately you start to see yourself, the more you will start to realize that we're all carrying damage and that we effectively need to be recreated from the inside out. And that is a big part of what Jesus came to do. I think if you start to look at your own inner life more carefully and honestly, a lot more of what Jesus said will start to make sense. Thanks.
Great. Well, we've got lots of questions, some really, really good questions. If we don't get to your question, the speakers will be on stage after the talk, so feel free to come and chat to them there. Do you think the general statement, blacks are always late, is a racist comment or a statement of fact?
Good grief. Look, I mean, there are cultural differences between people groups that we have to acknowledge and that are neutral, and I don't think they're particularly an issue. I would be careful about generalizing in general, if that's not internally incoherent. I think generalizations are harmful, and we need to just be careful not to make generalizations as far as possible. Maybe Salonga knows culturally whether there's something to that. Let me pass over to him, and he can put himself on the spot.
I think it's good to steer clear of generalizations.
Can I add, am I allowed to add something?
You can.
I think it is worth saying, isn't it, that if you live in suburban Cape Town and you drive a motor car, it is easy to forget that many folk have to commute by public transport for long distances, unreliable public transport for long distances that often makes them late. And to then generalize that into a racial statement is a very dangerous and unhelpful thing when you're sitting in the privilege of your BMW air-conditioned car. And so we've got to be careful that we don't just jump to things out of a kind of an inbred generalization on our part. I don't know if that's any help.
These questions are all sort of along the same subject matter of economics. So I'll just read them all and you can maybe come up with a general answer for all of them. So there's lots of inequality in terms of socio-economics here in South Africa. How can we fight against this as Christians? Then how should a white Christian deal with BEE? Or BBEE now, I think. Keep adding B's and E's. Sorry, racism is also in reverse in the country now. Are we not perpetuating racism now, which is evil, by now continuing seeing color by insisting black be chosen over white?
Thank you very much. Those are all good questions. I think that that economically BEE is necessary on account of the fact that there is so much social inequality. I mean, we've had hundreds of years of colonial rule, which has been overturning the way that that society ran. Someone quoted a statistic, I can't verify it, that before colonialism, India contributed a third to the world economy. That India was a third of the world economy on its own. After colonialism was 5%. That's how much of it was drained by what happened in colonialism. I think also what I've been trying to say is that racism or that prejudice is something that we're not conscious of it. So even I would be fairly critical in our own circles when we've got a problem to solve in the church here in Africa. We normally look to Australia or England, or we fly someone in from the States or wherever to come and tell us what to do. But we don't ask, well, what have African theologians thought? What do people who are in the townships think? What solutions have we actually come up with? We will trust people that we think are superior to ourselves even. But certainly that's where we look to find people who are going to be able to know their answer. We look to the West. I think that we don't even recognize all sorts of prejudices. Sexism would be the same. We just speak what we know because we've been schooled in it for so long. So I think BEE is not there to try and be reverse racist. It's saying you need to actually be forced to move out of your prejudicial system and to counteract that inequality that has been put in place over many, many centuries. So I think that it's acknowledging that employers will employ people they trust, and they won't trust black people if they're white employers because they're white employers. And I think it's a necessary correction. So yeah, I think if you want to look at it in a certain way, maybe you'll consider it to be a racist system, but I think that there is a necessary corrective that it's trying to achieve, and I think that there's no other way around it. The idea that we can now be colorblind is similarly a problem. If it were possible, it would be wonderful, but it isn't possible. We do see with color. I mean, you can see it happening in the States. There's a number of black commentators. A rapper that I quite like called Propaganda wrote a song on this that caused a whole furore among the church, where he criticized ministers for saying it's your privilege as white people to be able to say we don't have to talk about race, that racism isn't a problem here, much as we would say it's, we as male ministers, of course we've got women at heart. We're looking after the women in our congregation perfectly well. We don't need a women's minister. We think we see clearly, but we of course are looking through the glasses that we're looking through. If you've got tainted glasses on, if you've got color, if you've got rose-tinted spectacles, you don't know that you're looking at the world with everything pink. It's just how you see. You can't take the glasses off unless you're a particularly self-critical person. So we need those pressures from outside to take off the glasses and go, oh my goodness, they're pink. That's how these things work. So if we could be colorblind, that would be great. We aren't colorblind, so we need help.
These are all, again, asking the same question. There's 5 questions, all pretty much saying the same thing. What about the massive institutionalized racism of blacks towards whites? Whites are often made to feel guilty, which allows black people to get away with racism. And then, are only white people racists? Is racism only one way, i.e. white on black? A 702 radio presenter recently said that black racism does not exist, i.e. it was impossible for black people to be racist. What's your opinion on that? And then finally, while I agree with everything said, do you not think it is unhelpful that all examples of racism mentioned were always white on black? Furthermore, do black South Africans have a right to have racist feelings now because of the past?
Yeah, I think black South Africans have a reason for resentment, and I think we need to acknowledge that more than we do. We've been forgiven a huge debt to be allowed to live without molestation, without our property taken away, because everything we've done to people has not been done to us. So we need to acknowledge that, I think. If we were a little bit more grateful for what has been given to us as white South Africans, I think a lot of the anger that still remains might have been undone. But no, the answer is no. Black people can obviously be racist. The reason why the radio presenter, I assume, would have said that is that racism is generally a power structure. What could a black person say to me? What slur could he utter to make me feel bad? There's pretty much nothing. I mean, you could say, you're a cracker, and I could go, okay, I lack style and I'm not good at dancing, but I already knew that. So it's not going to hurt my feelings. I've got too much weight of history behind me, too much affirmation, too much white privilege for that to hurt me. There's nothing that person can do because there is no power structure that he can wield against me to make me feel bad. What I think we don't often realize, what I've come to understand, and I think this is correct, is that the difference between white children and black children in this country, if you ask them, if you went to a township school, or if you speak to people in the Cape Flats, if you speak to children, non-white children, they tend to believe that there is no hope, that they don't have opportunities, and that they lack worth. If you speak to a white child about what they're going to do, they'll tell you any job in the world and they'll believe they'll be able to do it. If they start up a business and it fails, they'll go live with their parents until they're back on their feet, and they won't feel like it's a problem. They won't feel like they're a failure. They'll feel like they have all the opportunities in the world, that the world is their oyster. And that's a huge difference between white and black that we can't fully understand, I think. That the difference between us is that we, as white people, we've got all of this weight of affirmation behind us, of being told that we're great and that we can do anything we like, and the opposite has been true of other people. So when I'm racist against a black person, I'm wielding that hammer of saying you're worthless, and history has said you're worthless, and you do have no position here. I wield that against the person. When he tries to wield it back at me, what's he got? He's got nothing. So it's not that black people can't be prejudiced, and obviously that conversation needs to be had. But as white people, we don't acknowledge our racism, or we think rather because our role in it was small, or because we aren't the architects of apartheid, that we don't have any role in it, or that it doesn't matter anymore, that we can be colorblind. But it's just simply not true. And to let our racism come out, where we still say things like, the boy is here today, so I can't do that. People, I mean, even in the church, I've heard that kind of language, or no, the madam isn't here. That kind of stuff. We use this language unconsciously as though it's not a thing. And we don't realize how we hurt people, so we need to acknowledge that to stop the damage from the white side of things, and then we can address the damage once we're a bit more on neutral ground. So it's a power structure. Obviously, in South Africa, better than America at least, black South Africa will hold power probably forever, and that's probably right. And so it'll need to be a conversation that is had. But I think for most of the congregation here, it's a conversation we haven't had enough about ourselves.
Jordan, I'm cheating and sticking 2 in here, but maybe you can just address both of them. In SA, there's a lack of understanding of each other's culture and value system, which fuels a difference between white and black. So therefore a lack of tolerance and a racism from both sides. Please comment on this point. And then the other question, is recognizing our own racism enough? It's an easy way out to say that I'm racist while there's damage to be repaired, work to be done.
Yeah, there is work to be done. I think that I would have loved it if we had all been given several hours of community service as white people as punishment for the past, and we could all just have contributed back to our country by working it out. And I think that one way or another we need to encourage mixing of cultures, understanding people better. As soon as we remove the prejudicial attitudes where my culture is by default better and yours is worse, then I think we can start to see the value in each, and that'll help. Economically and in other ways, I think that white South Africa, it's very hard to know how we can address the problem, how we can fix the problem. I don't think we can fix the problem, but acknowledging it is the start. And being generous towards our brothers and sisters in whatever ways we can doesn't hurt.